what got it. All right, just a little bit on to like complement what Dirk said. Yes, so I started my academic career in Canada doing a PhD in shock-induced ignition, which is like really the physics that governs detonations. That was in Canada. Then shortly after, I worked at Shell in heavy oil research. So a bit of a detour from what I do right now, but it was a very interesting experience to learn, you know, how research is conducted in industrial settings. Then I went, because I really wanted to stay within academic environments, I went to Caltech for 4 years and was working on thermal induced ignition, which is the other side of things. So I went from shock induced ignition to thermal ignition. So igniting gases via diffusive processes, and everything was in the context of fuel tank safety. So we had a strategic collaboration with Boeing when we were there. And then after that, I ended up getting because of personal reasons, I wanted to get closer to my family, closer to Europe. So I got a position in France, and I started at the Institut PPrime in December 2017. And I landed in the detonation team, a team that works on detonation fundamentals, that has been really pushing forward rotating detonation engines and propulsion via detonations rather than deflagrations. And then part of my group, it's been really working on pushing the boundaries, both experimentally, theoretically, and numerically, to resolve DDT, which is the acceleration of flames from very laminar all the way to the transition to detonation. So sometimes this happens as a result of interactions with obstacles, and sometimes this happens just because we have viscous heatings in very narrow tubes, right? But that's just a very brief introduction of how I got where I'm at right now. And really the topic that we'll be discussing today, it's on a very canonical configuration. I mean, I would really call it semi-canonical, because we take our initial conditions from an experiment that it's a bit larger than the typical scales that you would see in detonation simulations, which is of the order of a few cell sizes. And I will discuss what a cell size is in detonations, and then we'll go from there. But of course, because detonations is a little bit of a niche topic, I will do my best to make sure that I give you a little bit of fundamentals before we get into the meat of the presentation. And last but not least, this is work that has been carried out with one of my collaborators, Brian Maxwell, who's a professor, assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University in the United States. And we met when we were both PhD students in Canada. That said, as I said, I will start with a little bit of context, why we do combustion, you know, particularly accidental combustion events, and how the canonical configuration that we'll be dealing with fits within a typical accidental combustion event. Then I'll give a very brief crash course on combustion. So if we have, I don't know, maybe students or in the audience, then I can draw a parallel between the typical deflagrations and what people typically associate with combustion and what we actually do, the other mode or the other traveling wave that we have in reactive systems, and then a little bit of detonation fundamentals and what are the things that matter when you want to actually size facilities, for instance, in industrial settings. And then part two would be the actual talk in which we go in depth into the actual dynamics of detonations and diffuse interactions. So with that in mind, so why do we do combustion? I think that, you know, most of you have seen a figure like this, but this is an interesting way of visualizing that we have really gone from burning traditional biomass, right? So this is, we have time in the x-axis, and then this is just in the scale as a percentage. So we went from pretty much burning something which in the 1800s was biomass to in present day burning something else, right? But in the end, the takeaway is that we always burn something. The share, of course, changes, right? So we went from, as I said, wood and all these things to now a mix of oil, coal, and we continue to burn biomass. But the takeaway from this is that we really burn stuff to sustain our lifestyle. Okay, so even though we have, you know, all this push for going electric and all that, in the end, you have a primary energy source and a primary location where you generate or where you produce this electricity that then will feed all these other things. And typically, unless it's really coming from renewables, it will most likely come from burning either natural gas or coal, right? This sounds a little bit of a pessimistic statement, saying that the picture is unlikely to change, but you know, in the near future, really, what I would say we really need to push for is for efficiency, right? So we've been burning things, we know how to burn them, we have pretty efficient processes, but we can continue pushing that efficiency. And one way of pushing for that is to investing in low carbon or biofuels or hydrogen enriched, which is an actual initiative in the aerospace sector, for example, or maritime, where, you know, we have significant energy demands. And then, of course, there's the carbon free, where you go full hydrogen, or you take ammonia as a carrier and then you convert it into hydrogen at some point into the process, right? But really, what this picture and what I say, you know, there's a push for efficiency. What that is not an isolated idea that us doing combustion are trying to sustain or to justify our research, but it's something that it's been actually studied. And there was a recent article in the Financial Times in which they actually concluded kind of like the same thing that I've been just saying, right? That efficiency measures could be a very efficient tool to curb CO2 emissions. So that push for efficiency that most of us in combustion are trying to advocate for, I think is definitely a valid way of achieving our sustainable development goals, right? So all this begs the questions, right? Is the future electric? I already discussed that a lot of this, you know, comes from actually burning something and then you just plug it in at home or at one of these charging stations. And in my opinion, we really need to think inclusively, and depending on the location and the place where you'll be using the energy and your end use, you will have a diverse source or a diverse mix where the actual solutions could come from or could best deliver for the needs that we have. Okay, regarding the carbon-free combustion, this is the picture that the European Union pretty much dove her head first. So based on producing hydrogen via electrolyzers fed by renewable energy and then trickling down the value chain and every single aspect of society. So from public transport to agriculture to producing residential heating, right? And of course, as well, the potential of using it for your own cars, right? If hydrogen vehicles. Of course, the previous slide showed a very optimistic and very nice picture, but in particular with hydrogen, as opposed to, you know, typical hydrocarbons, we have issues or concerns, right? And one of them is the fact that we have super wide flammability limits, significantly wider than you would expect with hydrocarbons. You can see the numbers there for typical fuels used in industry. The fact that you have very low ignition energies, and also the fact that it's super light. And then when you have a gas that is very light, then you either have to increase the pressure to put inside a container the same amount of mass that will make it competitive with others, with other type of fuels like liquids and liquid fuels like what we currently use. But obviously going up in pressure could lead to potential safety issues. And then the other option would be, okay, let's liquefy it. But in the case of hydrogen, we need to get to cryogenic temperatures, and that's very expensive. Okay, so keeping that in mind, there's concerns from production all the way to handling. And I would say that the most pressing one is that picture that I show right here, where when you give all these new technologies or fuels that are significantly that need more care to be handled, then you really need to make sure that the public is ready for it. Okay, and part of our job as combustion scientists is to make sure that we understand the risks so that we can then relay all those learnings to policymakers and those who are writing the codes for safety distances, etc. Which brings us to accidental combustion events, right? And I think you may already know the answer to this, but I will ask the question. So what does a single accident in these industries that are shown right here, aircraft, nuclear, chemical, and mining, have in common? I'll give you the answer right away. What one single accident in these industries have in common is the fact that could lead to large-scale destruction, losses of lives, and huge environmental impact. So you really want to make sure that when you're dealing with potential risks, that you understand them properly. And the thing is that in each of these industries, and in most industries that we have, right, in the productive sectors, you will be handling fuels, and whenever there's a fuel present, there's the risk of a fuel leak and potential ignition of those. So our as I said, our role is to try to understand how to prevent those events, right? And this is just a bit of an overview of how an accident takes place, and then I'm just going to go very quickly through this flow chart. So you typically, as I said, start with a combustible mixture that could be inside a container, right? If for some reason you have a rupture or there's a human error, whatever, this leads to a fuel release, then if there's an ignition source, that will create a flame. If the flame interacts with obstacles, then there's an increase in surface area that then will increase in turn the burning rate. If you increase the burning rate, you accelerate. If you accelerate, you could potentially transit into a detonation, right? So typically in accidents, this is what would happen. You will go through this route, to the route of thermal ignition, flame propagation, acceleration, deflagration to detonation transition, which is one of my core research activities, and then towards detonation propagation. If you have very high pressures, if you're storing those fuels at very high pressures, then you could potentially ignite a detonation directly, but this is less likely, okay? And most of the stuff that I've been working on is really based on safety. So it's been motivated by safety aspects. But since my arrival to PPrime, I've been also looking at the effect of, or at the potential application of detonations to propulsion, which I will give you a little bit of a side note at a later slide. And the main takeaway from this is that accidents have happened. So we have accidents, the largest accident in France, actually, in a mine, in a coal mine in 1904. Buncefield, which was an accident in the UK in 2005, in which there was forensic evidence of the actual existence of a potential detonation in open space, which before this particular investigation, people thought that detonations were very unlikely to take place in accidental scenarios, because you need confinement and you need proper reflection of triple points, as you will see later. And the accident in Beirut, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So that was just improper storage of hazardous materials that could lead to significant property loss and losses of lives, as I said it before, right? So a very brief crash course on combustion so that we make sure that we're on the same page. Okay, so reacting flow, we all know, is fluid mechanics, heat transfer, thermodynamics, and chemistry. So it's the combination of those four pillars of science. How do we make sense of this in addition to the typical experiments? Is we have continuum mechanics, right? So we have a mathematical description of nature, right? So we conserve mass, momentum, species, and energy. And then depending on the physics that we're interested in, there's some terms that you could neglect or that you need to keep, right? Typically in detonations, you neglect diffusive terms. So you're not interested in heat and species diffusion because of the timescales at which the relevant physical phenomena takes place. But in the particular case that we're looking at, we will keep those terms because we're looking at diffuse interfaces, okay? So that's going to be important to keep in mind. Now, some of the challenges different from what you typically see in cold flows, where you can actually resolve all the scales and you have base solutions that you can use. In reacting flows is a bit more complicated because, I mean, I would say one of the most pressing issues is the size of the mechanism. So if you really want to have a proper description of the chemistry, you need to carry significant amount of species and reactions. And what that means is for each species that you carry, that's an additional equation in the system of equations that I showed in the previous slide. And then if you want to resolve the scales, then you have to go from the size of your experimental facility, or if you're looking at industrial settings, from the size of your plant, which is could be, you know, a few tens of meters or more, depending on how much you want to simulate, to actually resolving reaction fronts and reaction zones. And in detonations in particular, it's very important to resolve the front because that's what leads to the typical cellular structure of detonations that I will explain in a few slides. All right, so if you take those equations and you seek for traveling wave solutions, you have two limits. You have the limits of deflagrations, which is what people are most familiar with, right? So the propagation physics is by heat and mass diffusion, right? And you have detonations, which is the other end of the spectrum, where the physics of propagation is shock-induced ignition, okay? So you have a shock that brings your thermodynamic conditions to a temperature and pressure such that your reactions get initiated right away, right? So across this detonation interface, you typically have a density increase and a pressure increase, okay? Whereas in flames, you know, if you're looking at flames that are not propagating very fast, then you can make the assumption of isobaric flames, right? And then you have, because you have hot products right here in this region, then you heat up the fresh gases ahead of your front, and then this leads to a autocatalytic reaction that just continues to drive the front forward. So deflagrations, heat and mass diffusion, detonations, shock-induced ignition. And the other very important difference is the propagation speeds, right? In deflagrations, you have meters per second, or even a tenth of a meter per second for most hydrocarbons, or of that order. Whereas in detonations, you really go into the kilometer per second realm. So a 3 order of magnitude difference. Okay, and as a result, you have different metrics that you would measure experimentally depending on what your interest is, right? So you have deflagrations, in which what you care about is the laminar flame speed and making sure that your mechanisms reproduce the laminar burning speeds that you measure experimentally. As I said, heat and mass diffusion is the driving physics. The metric of interest is the laminar burning velocity. When you're simulating this, your code has to properly reproduce these changes, and your mechanisms have to reproduce it as well. And in detonations, what we're interested in, because as I said, it's no longer heat and mass diffusion, but shock-induced ignition. It's your ignition delay time, okay? So your metric of interest in detonations is the delay time. Also, the effective activation energy is very important for classifying detonations. And the effective activation energy would be simply the slope of a typical ignition delay time inverse temperature diagram, like this one you see here. So just keep in mind that the effective activation energy is a very important metrics for classifying detonations. So they're both fundamental properties, and you can you typically measure them, so they can be experimentally determined. Now, I would argue that most people know what a flame looks like, right? You've seen a fireplace, you've seen a candle, you've seen all this, right? But those that are not really working on detonations, I don't think they know what a detonation looks like. And even if you haven't been doing experiments or looked at images of detonations, you don't really know what a detonation looks like, right? So this is what a detonation looks like. If you ignite, you put a reacting mixture inside a tube, you ignite it from the close end, and you allow that front to transit into a detonation, and you zoom into and you look into the front. This is what you see. So this very dark line is the shock that I mentioned before in the simplest description of a detonation wave, the 1D laminar description of it. And then you see that is followed by these horizontal streaks right here, right? So those horizontal streaks are actually transverse waves. So if you zoom into this front right here and you go inside, this is what you would see. So you see that the front is not actually planar, but curved, and that curvature is actually being produced by the constant collision of these transverse waves that you see here, right? And then these triple points that are formed by the leading shock, which is right here, and this transverse wave that creates triple points, then those trajectories, if you put a soot foil, so if you just take a plate, sorry, of metal, and you put it with a torch, you deposit soot in that plate, and you put this inside your detonation tube, and you allow a detonation to propagate through that tube, and you take that soot foil from your tube, then this is what you will see. You'll see like a fish scale structure, and this is what we call the cell size in detonations. Okay, and those structures are actually drawn by triple points. Those triple points that you see kind of like right here in this schematic, as you have this collision of transverse waves, and the transverse waves moving apart as the explosion takes place within these fronts. So that's the cell size, and it's a very important metric. So we use it to classify detonations, and then you typically have regular and irregular mixtures, and that's depending on how your cellular structure looks like. Most fuels look like this one right here. So most fuels are irregular, and typically the activation energy that you have associated to this type of structures is what we call a high activation energy, right? Now, if you go towards lower activation energies, then you get to patterns that are very, very that only exhibit one length scale. So very uniform. That's the word that I was looking for. So unless you highly dilute your mixture in argon, the cell size is not a well-defined quantity. And sometimes then we have to take averages, and then that's what they typically do in safety engineering, that you have to just rely on averages, right? As I said, this is relatively easy to measure, but there's quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of how to properly report this. Averages, in my opinion, is not the proper way to report it. Histograms would be a better way to have a better sense of what the length scales that are present in that type of mixture are. But the takeaway right here is that the cell size could be either be regular or irregular, and depending on the chemistry, right? So if you have low or high activation energy, and that is whether you have different levels of dilution or different levels of equivalence ratio, if you have different initial conditions, then your cell size will change. Now, if we look at a plot of the cell size versus equivalence ratio, this is what you see. You see that the cell size increases dramatically as you move away from stoichiometry, right? I have 3 mixtures just as representative examples. So as you move away from a stoichiometry, you have a significant increase in your cell size. Lambda, which is the cell size of detonations, is useful for explosion hazards and safety evaluations and engineering. And limiting behavior, which is what we'll be looking at, quenching, reinitiation, and all that, is typically scaled as your either geometrical facility or a length scale that is relevant to the problem that you're trying to solve, to the cell size. Okay, so that's why I took the time to actually explain what the cell size is, so that you understand what we'll be doing later in the talk. And one of the issues that I want to bring up right here is, if you compare the cell sizes for hydrogen air compared to, say, a proxy for natural gas, which is typically methane air, you get into cell sizes that are really small compared to the typical cell sizes that you have for methane air, for instance. So what this means is that you have an increased risk of detonations when you switch to a more reactive mixture like hydrogen. Okay, something to keep in mind. Now, as I said, triple points are key, right? So depending on whether you partially reflect those triple points or those triple points get transmitted. So depending on the boundary conditions that you have, you will either make the detonation propagate nicely, or you would make the detonation fail, right? So if we were to put these two walls closer and closer together, then we get into a regime where heat and friction losses become important, and then the shock wave will decouple, and then your detonation will fail. So as I said, that in detonations, the shock makes the chemistry go, right? So if your shock is not strong enough for auto-ignition to take place, then your reaction zone will decouple from your leading shock, right? So if you close these two walls, that's a way of decoupling the leading shock from the reaction zone. Or the other way is by removing one of these walls, right? And removing one of those walls would be transmitting a detonation from a tube, for example, into an open volume, right? And then the mechanism of quenching in this particular scenario would be the fact that you have expansions that run from the corners into the detonation wave and quench the chemistry because the temperature drops, right? So that's the loss mechanism in this particular case. Whereas in this particular case, if you were to reduce the size in between those two walls, then you get into actual potential for heat losses that will decouple the wave. So for propagation in channels, as I said, you have metrics that could give you, as a function of the cell size, what is the minimum tube diameter, for example, that allows or that will sustain a detonation inside, or what is the size of this gap that will result in successful transmission of a detonation into an open volume, right? And those are typically given as those numbers right there. And that depends on whether the mixture is regular or irregular, because of what I mentioned, all the different length scales that we have. And we have reported values that are as high as 40 lambda or as low as 3 lambda. The value of 3 lambda that I quote here is the value for hydrogen. All right, now we go into the talk. So I think that right now we're in a better shape for those that haven't seen or been exposed to detonations in the past. Really, the takeaway is that detonations exhibit a cellular structure, that detonations have, the physics is shock-induced ignition. So you need a strong shock to make sure that your reaction is initiated. And that depending on the chemistry and whether you are with different equivalence ratios, then your cell size increases dramatically as you move away from stoichiometry. Okay, so we'll go into this non-ideal detonation propagation and the actual talk. But before that, a small parenthesis just to show a very interesting application of detonations as well, which is the fact that you can put these detonations and put them into actual combustors, and those detonations could produce significant thrust. So there's been a significant effort in the team, in the lab at Institut PPrime, trying to understand and trying to to contribute to the fundamentals of rotating detonation engines. And some of the issues that you see in these rotating detonation engines, which in their simplest form is simply two concentric cylinders. So you have one cylinder here and one outer cylinder, and then a detonation that propagates in that gap, right? So the pressure, they typically call this pressure gain combustion. So the pressure that is generated behind the detonation wave and then the expansion of the combustion products lead to thrust, right? But as you can see, you have significant non-idealities in this type of flows. And one of the applications of the canonical configuration that we'll be studying is also observed in this type of engines, is the fact that you're confined by a layer of burned gases. So this would be a detonation that propagates, and depending on the conditions here, then you have a minimum height that will allow the steady propagation of that detonation. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of non-idealities in this type of flows, but some of the canonical configurations that you find in safety applications, you also find in this type of engines, namely the fact that you have confinement by a gas. So the overarching goal of the talk is to gain fundamental understanding of non-ideal detonations, actually not of the talk, but one of the goals that we have in the team, right? And the way we do this is we combine experiments with numerical efforts. We try to come up with configurations that are canonical enough so that we can learn from them. In this particular case, I call it semi-canonical because it's there's a lot of variation, and you'll see. And some of the questions is, can we predict what we observe experimentally? Do we have the physics, and do we understand the physics enough, or do we have we included the physics necessary to predict what we see? And then can we reproduce the observed transmission and propagation dynamics? Okay. So now I'm going to divide between sharp and diffuse interfaces. And as I said, everything is relative to the cell size, right? So that this lambda value, right? So in this particular figure right here on the left-hand side, I have a sharp interface. So the way the experiment was done, this experiment was done at Caltech actually, they had a membrane where they separated reactive mixture from fresh mixture. And then they had a biofilm right here that separated that, the reacting from the inert mixture. And then they had a detonation interact with that sharp interface, right? Which is with actually the holder of the membrane is visible here, right? And then in a diffuse interface, you actually create it by having gases with different molecular weights. You open a valve and then you allow that gravity current to develop, and then you make a detonation propagate. And as you can see, the actual dynamics is quite different, right? So a sharp interface would be defined if the cell size of the mixture is actually significantly larger than the size of the interface. And a diffuse interface would be defined as the opposite. So if your cell size is actually significantly smaller than the size of the interface, or as well, you could argue if it's of comparable size, it could also qualify as a diffuse interface. I'm going to try to play a video. Can you see this video? Okay, so this is the video of a detonation interacting with a sharp interface at 45 degrees, and really what's important to show here is that the coupling of the reaction zone with the detonation wave. You see, this is an oblique shock. Right there is where the interface is located. And then, of course, because you have no reacting flow where the interface is, then this just continues to separate. So this is the coupling right here between the shock wave and the transmitted shock wave, and regions of that could potentially lead to reactions is what leads to quenching. And then the dynamics is a bit different for a diffuse interface, right? Where right here is where the reacting mixture is. You see a transmitted shock and then some regions of what you would call a turbulent mixing zone. And as you move away from where the gradients are, then you see the coupling of the leading shock with the reaction zone, okay? So ultimately, what will lead to failure is if your leading shock decouples. And of course, this decoupling took place because the detonations was transmitted into inert region. Diffuse interfaces are more likely upon accidental fuel leaks. So if you have a leak, then what you would have is really a diffuse interface rather than this very lab type configuration. And I touched upon some of the issues with using lambda to characterize behavior, right? So we said that it's difficult to measure experimentally because if you have layers that are changing, it's not uniquely defined, as I said. Properly capture the variation between the diffuse interfaces is complex. Then you need to resolve the detonation front. So if you're really interested in industrial size facilities, then that becomes complex. And if we look at implicit models, then we really have lack of energy dissipation mechanism, diffusive processes as what I show, and then the fact that, of course, if you have no diffusion, then your solutions do not converge. But they provide, even if you were to neglect diffusive effects, you do learn quite a bit, which is typically what you do in the detonation community. And this is what happens with the cell size. This is just a picture to show what happens with the cell size as the gradient of equivalence ratio increases. In other words, as you increase the gradient of equivalence ratio, then the size of your cells increase. Okay, so now we go into the actual meat of our talk. So diffuse interface interaction, and really what we want to find is what is the critical cell size gradient that leads to quenching. And this work was actually published in the Proceedings of the Combustion Institute, not the last one, but the one 2 years ago in Australia. So we want to examine failure and reinitiation mechanisms. This is the experiment that we're targeting. This is just a bit of a comparison with the simulations that we run using the methodology of my colleague Brian Maxwell, and some important flow features, right? Namely, that you have the detonation front where the reactant mixture is, right? We typically have a transmitted shock wave and a turbulent mixing zone right there in between the transmitted shock wave and the interface between combusted gases and shocked but not combusted gases, right? So we're going to use the CLEM-less methodology. I'm going to go very quickly over this. So it's been, I think, one of the only efforts in the detonation community to try to bring some LES simulations into the community. It relies on the linear eddy model. It's been reformulated to take into account compressible flows. You reduce all the small scales, so all your subgrade is really, it relies to a one-dimensional diffusion reaction problem, and it's been validated in some works by my colleagues, namely in his thesis and in some works that deal with detonation in channels and some DDT. This is typically where, in the Borghi diagram, for those that are more into turbulent combustion, this is where our combustion regime lies. Okay, this is just so that you land a little bit where we're looking at, and it's just, you know, the standard filtering LES on the large scales. We have standard momentum closures and reaction rate closures on the small scales given by these expressions here. And then really one thing to keep in mind is that we have this concept of turbulent steering, in which we take 1D profile in the subgrid, and then we take what would an actual laminar, or not a laminar, but a 1D profile would look like if it had interacted with a vortex. And then this is what you then use as part of your subgrid. But if you want more details, there are papers, there's a full thesis in which the whole entire framework is presented. So we touch briefly on some of the challenges. So if we really want to model this, if we're interested in industrial relevant scales, we need to have some sort of modeling. We can't really do it with DNS. It's very, very expensive because of the length scales that we have, because of potential diffusive processes that might be important, especially if you have irregular detonations. The fact that lambda is not uniquely defined, even if you have gradients. And then, of course, when you try to model this at significant or with geometries that are of significant size, then you need to find a way of making it tractable and cost efficient. So one way of doing it that is quite popular in the detonation community, and that I've been trying to actually move away from, but in this particular work we stayed with it because of the size of the problem, is that we typically reduce the chemistry to a one-step global mechanism. Okay, so and then we have some parameters that we want to look into, because we have also the diffusive terms. Then we're not only targeting the induction times, but we're also targeting what the burning velocity would be for in the post-shock conditions for shocks that are propagating and half the steady propagation velocity, which is called the CJ velocity. And then, of course, there's some calibration constants that are used to reproduce the cell size, right? So this is what the simulation gives in terms of cell sizes. This is what the experiment gives. And the cell size is of the order of 2 millimeters. And the diffuse interface that we're looking at has thicknesses. You will see that the thickness varies depending on where we are, but that on average are of the order of 3.5 to 4 centimeters, right? So we lie within the definition of a diffuse interface. So this is how the simulations are carried out. So they're 2D. We compute a gravity current using open foam with proper diffusion and transport. That's to make sure that we reproduce the thickness properly. And then we take those fields, and when we use the methodology that I described to then look at the detonation diffuse interface interaction. So this is how the gravity current initiates, right? So we start with the actual ethylene mixture right here at the actual composition that was used in the experiment, and we allow it to propagate into nitrogen, which is what they had in the experiment, and then we allow for the gravity current to develop. Then we take two instances in which we are going to look at the interaction. So at t equals to 1 second, over here roughly, and at t equals to 2.2 seconds, just because they're representative of the actual waiting times that they had in the experiment. And as you see, there's differences in the thickness, and then we map this to use as initial conditions in our simulations. And then, of course, the speed of the gravity current was measured experimentally at the lab, so we made sure that our simulation captured properly the propagation speeds of the head of the gravity current. So we have some of the soot foils, right? So this is just to make a contrast with a sharp interface. I have another video to show, right? Where if you have an horizontal interface, then you have a transmitted shock and then turbulent mixing zone right here. And then in the actual diffuse interface that we're looking at, we have another video to show, then we have a bit of a different outcome. And the outcome is that, wait, I think I'm playing the same video, sorry. Yeah, okay. We'll see a video after. So what we see here is right where you have the reacting mixture, you see a very uniform pattern for if you have a sharp interface. But if you have a diffuse interface, what you see is that depending on the thickness, and as you saw the evolution of the actual initial condition, you have a different thickness here, then here, then here, and then here. So depending on the value of that thickness, you will have different dynamics, and you see some of those triple points actually running away into the interface, and sometimes leading to reignitions or quenching. Okay, so the diffuse interface exhibit quenching and reinitiation in the diffuse layer, which would be, say, in between my mass fraction 0.9 and 1, whereas in the sharp interface you really see no triple point transmission, or not as evident as what you see here. Now we need to map, because we're using simplified chemistry, we need to map my reactant, which is the single step kinetics that I'm using, to the actual size of my detonations, right? So for that, we had to run extra simulations to be able to find a proper correlation between the cell size and the amount of reactant that I have, right? Because the fact that we're using simplified kinetics doesn't allow us to actually have equivalence ratio changes. We can only somewhat include dilution changes by doing an exercise like this. And then what we did is we run with initial conditions of 1, 0.8, 0.6, and 0.5, and then we fitted this particular correlation to an exponential form, which is what you see in the dependence of the cell size with dilution as well, right? So then with this, we can compute a gradient of cell size that then allow us to map on those soot foils where you see most of the cellular activity, right? So if we compute the gradient of cell size, if you look at the case at 1 second, then you see that you start to see some activity, or most of the activity is enclosed for gradients below 0.5. You kind of see the same for a more fully developed diffuse interface, but you see a lot of activity right here, right? So in between 0.1 and 0.5, you see quite a bit of triple points that are being transmitted, right? So the critical, or the average critical cell size gradient that we find, right? So most of the cellular dynamics is enclosed for values below 0.5, is really a direct consequence of the dynamics within the interface. And most of the more conservative metrics that they've been using, and some previous work have suggested, is the use of a cell size gradient of 0.1 as indicative of failure. But depending on this thickness of your interface, then you see that that could lead to actual cellular dynamics taking place within that interface. So how do we determine the actual critical cell size gradient? So the way of doing it is, we found the soot foils as the maximum inverticity, and then we can map the gradient that we found to the place where the cellular structure stops. And then with that, we can, so that's pretty much the intersection of this line, because right there you have no fluctuations, and then you see where the actual gradient lies, and then we can find that and define it at every single location along X. And then if we do that, we can plot pictures like this, where it tells us what the critical gradient is along X, because we have different thicknesses, and then we can also plot what the critical size gradient is as a function of interface thickness using these results. And then what we find is that the thicker your interface is, the more likely you are to lead to potential transmission and reinitiations. And then what this plot shows right here is precisely that, is the dynamics within the interface that leads to runaway triple points, quenched areas where, you know, no red reactions are happening, right? So red is a proxy for the regions where reactions are happening. And it could be that two of those triple points actually meet, and you can actually reinitiate a detonation within that interface. So triple point transmission is characteristic of the detonation-diffuse interface interactions, which is different from what happens with sharp interface interactions, where most of the triple points reflect, as you saw. So applicability, in agreement with previous work, the higher or the thicker the interface, you favor transmission. These values are not to be taken as hard limits because they depend on the thickness of the layer, as I showed. There's an inverse dependence with that. The thicker the layer, the smaller the gradient. Previous criteria of 0.1 is good for regions where undisturbed propagation takes place, but 0.5, which is the metric what we found, actually accounts for the cellular dynamics within the interface, right? So range of scales in lambda need to be accounted for, especially for irregular mixtures. And values may change if more complex descriptions of the chemistry are used. So we've actually looked at the critical heights for detonation transmission, and we've seen the significant difference that exists between simplified chemistry and detailed kinetics. But as I said, because of the size of the computation that we had, then we had to compromise somewhere, and this still leads to some interesting conclusions. Some of the future work is to investigate more canonical configurations. The reason why I call it semi-canonical is because we have a variation in interface thickness. So one could think of more canonical configurations where you keep that interface fixed and look at the limit that would lead between transmission and reflection of triple points as a function of interface thickness and acoustic impedance, which is also an important metric in reflections of triple points. And as I said, influence of chemical modeling and three-dimensional effects. So that's where we're trying to really push at this point. And with that, I think I'll close my presentation, and I want to thank Professor De Rukert for the invitation, and obviously the Dutch section of the Combustion Institute for giving me the podium to present some of my work. And with that, I open the floor for questions, and I think we have because we started late, maybe we have 5 minutes.
As mentioned, we can take a few more minutes, or 10 minutes.
Because we started late.